Good afternoon. I'm Sylvester Johnson, and this is Vox Humanities Conversations, a live streaming program from the Center for Humanities at Virginia Tech. As with all productions under the Vox Humanities media imprint, the Conversations initiative places its focus on advancing human-centered knowledge. We do this by engaging with experts and scholars whose work explores human life and human culture through a critical lens, and which serves to enhance public understanding around the impact of social disparity in a complex world. What makes Conversations unique is an emphasis on sharing stories that connect us to the humanity within the humanities. For each episode, we'll invite one or more guests to open a window onto the story of their scholarship, both the story that stands behind their work and the story that lives within. Practically every day that passes brings new issues or challenges for matters of national security and the US presidency. In the United States, the executive branch of government plays a complex role in connecting domestic politics to foreign policy. In addition, the pressures and quandaries for conducting such things as information warfare or public diplomacy are vast and require tremendous expertise. Our guest today, Professor Chad Levinson, is an expert on precisely these matters, and we're delighted he can be here for our Vox Humanities Conversations to discuss his work on the presidency and national security. Welcome, Professor Levinson. We're so glad you can join us.
Well, thank you, and I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for the invitation and this opportunity to talk with you.
Great. So let's begin by your telling us what you do here at Virginia Tech, and maybe share also one or two things you're working on.
Sure. I am an assistant professor in government and international affairs in the School of International and Public Affairs, which resides within the College of Liberal Arts and Human Sciences. I am currently working on a book manuscript called The Credibility Cartel, which was on the title card. I will have the opportunity to step away from teaching for a year and focus entirely on completing that manuscript through the support of the Library of Congress and the Kluge Fellowship. And in the meantime, I'll remain connected more than I might otherwise be through this program. So I'm grateful for that. The book is really a sort of theory and history of collaborations between presidents and independent outside organizations in the pursuit of foreign policy goals, primarily national security politics. And this history goes back to the interwar years through, empirically through the sort of near the end of the Cold War, with some sort of extrapolations into the present. It's as somebody who works in an historical mode, we have to often extrapolate to the present because our documentary base is often a little bit lagged over across time. So,
but yes, that's great, really fascinating, and wondering if we could start delving into some of the matters that you have been studying and writing about. I'm curious, for example, of what you perceive to be one of the most difficult challenges that the US presidency role faces concerning national security.
Well, I think, and this is a troubling answer to give in some ways. I actually think one of the biggest national security challenges is domestic radicalization. And I mean, there are certainly challenges with nuclear proliferation. There's certainly challenges with respect to, the war in the Ukraine, our, sort of geopolitical competition with China. But the most immediate and gravest national security threat, from my point of view, is domestic radicalization. This has to do, and on several fronts. We have, the problem of the militarization of our own domestic security forces, which is a sort of what we would call perhaps a second image reversed kind of problem. In IR studies, we talk about the second image as being the effects of domestic politics on international affairs. And the second image reversed is the effect of international affairs on domestic politics. And so a lot of, well, there's a problem of some of the war coming home to us in terms of that militarization. There's also the problem of disinformation and the opportunities it affords hostile actors on the outside, and I'm afraid to say it also on the inside, to exploit polarization and the tools of information dissemination that have become available to us and we still don't understand. And of course, for those of you who are following the drama over at Twitter, we're not quite sure where it's going to land by this afternoon. It reminds me actually of a doc. This problem is not new though. It reminds me of a document I came across this summer in the New York Public Library regarding an organization called the Citizens for Victory, which formed out of a number of different organizations that had been supporting the Allied war effort before Pearl Harbor. And after Pearl Harbor, they joined together to form the Citizens for Victory. And the new president wanted to set up what he would call propaganda workshops because he believed that the American people could be their own best propagandists. And this never really got off the ground. And I'm kind of grateful for that. And I'm concerned now because there is a tremendous facility and capability for hostile actors to use social media to turn the public into its own best propaganda army, which it's one thing if we're, drumming up support to fight against the Nazis. That's not the only thing that tool can be directed towards.
I'm
Go ahead.
thinking of January the 6th insurrection in terms of what you're saying. I'm sure this is something that's very much on the minds of you and others who are studying these issues. What you refer to as the radicalization of people within the United States who are understanding themselves in tension or opposition to government. But is that relevant?
Yes, that is absolutely relevant. I don't want to politicize my own answers too much, but that's impossible to avoid that topic. The struggle that the president has, I think, is to balance two very important competing principles, right? His obligation to protect national security, but also his obligation to protect the First Amendment and domestic civil liberties. And so it's a hard problem. And we've encountered some of that. President Biden has certainly encountered some of that problem. The struggle with the presidency is also recognizing the temptation to attain some political benefit from something that's actually very damaging and risky for the country. And I think back to the example of Wendell Willkie, who ran against President Roosevelt in 1940, and by all accounts ran a fairly brutal campaign on a lot of fronts, except for the question of the war. Right? He was actually a partner with Eleanor Roosevelt in the efforts to get the United States to support the Lend-Lease Act, for example. So Willkie was certainly a political competitor, but is a great example of resisting the urge to politicize national security to his own political benefit. And he knew fairly well that he would lose support, right, by not taking advantage of distinguishing himself from the sitting president at the time. And I'm concerned, frankly, again, to risk politicizing my own response here, that there are many political actors in the United States who have shown themselves unable to resist that temptation to take political advantage out of something that's damaging to the national security.
Yeah, no, there's so many important forces at work with the issues that you're identifying. And even the role of the presidency itself is something that I wonder whether it's fair to say is not so well understood at a granular level by most people in the US. You see people running for president and it looks like they're up there doing something. It's not always clear beyond our middle school social studies, 3 branches of government. We know there's the president, we know there's this legislative branch, we know there's the judiciary. But by examining particularly the context of national security, I imagine that you've been able to delve into some of really complex operations that are part of the presidency that might not be obvious to everyone. Could you say more about that and maybe even suggest some ways that that might be made more legible to more people?
Well, one thing that's made it much more legible to me is actually moving to Washington, D.C. Now, not everyone can do that.
Okay.
You encounter the physical presence of the government sort of everywhere. I've become a bit of an expert on identifying what helicopter is flying above me by the sound of its rotors. It's a very interesting airspace to live under. But more seriously, I sort of feel like there are two competing conventional views of the presidency that both miss the reality that I've come across, and of course not just me. There's the view, the sort of schoolhouse rock view, right? That sort of has President Washington, and the legislature, and it's sort of the constitutional view that we might learn in high school civics class. Which is still there. The foundation is, in fact, still there. But over the centuries and decades, there is a very complex apparatus that has been built around the presidency to empower the presidency. So, the agencies that were created by the National Security Act of 1947, with the National Security Council and the Central Intelligence Agency and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These are institutions that empower the president by moving a lot of policy making and information gathering closer to the White House, both physically, actually in physical proximity, but also in terms of sort of the org chart, right? And who the president can employ. The Eisenhower, the old executive office building, used to house most of the government of the United States, and it's one building. It's kind of a big building, but it's just one building. And now, of course, it's spread across Northern Virginia. In fact, in some cases, the entire country. And it's, of course, not just national security that made this happen. It has started before the National Security Act of 47 with following the Brownlow Commission, something called the Brownlow Commission, where he said, his commission told FDR, the government has all these new jobs. You need agencies, you need staff, people need to do this. And so that's really when the executive branch really started to grow. But that doesn't necessarily mean the president has become all powerful. This is the second view of the presidency, which some people call the Green Lantern sort of theory of the presidency, where they could sort of snap their fingers and magically have things happen. Harry Truman, when he handed over the presidency to Dwight Eisenhower, it's a famous quote. He said, "Poor Ike. This will not be anything like the army. He'll say, do this and do that, and nothing will happen." I think, judging from my view of the Eisenhower records, he knew already, because in the army you can say do this and do that and nothing will happen as well. It's not just the White House. So it's different from the sort of trim view of the president having a limited set of powers and a limited sort of staff. You sort of watch the West Wing, and it's sort of like 17 people that run the government. That's not how it is. It's thousands of people, but that makes it a sort of circus that you have to be a real master to make work towards your own goals and aims. And that's not even talking about the legislature or the courts, right? That's for another day, right?
Yes, yeah, that's another can of worms entirely. Well, this is very helpful and interesting and fascinating, because part of what I understand you to be saying is that there are some of these structural there are decisions through acts and the emergence of national security as a set of institutions that we might take for granted today, but as you said, has, like everything else in our society, it has a history. And so 1940s, that's on the tail end of the Second World War, and new organizations are going on. You talked about intelligence.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not that people haven't always gathered intelligence in some way, but I think what you're communicating to us, but there was a certain point in time when intelligence gathering became very integral to the very operation of government.
Yes.
And was that a global thing? Was the U.S. being very different from the rest of the world, or is that pattern also part of what was happening internationally?
We're venturing, I'm happy to do it. We're venturing a little far afield of my own direct expertise. So let me just put a big, recommend a grain of salt or two to take with what I say. I think we learned a great deal from the UK government, right? They were our chief partners in World War II. I think our intelligence operations really learned a lot from the collaborative project that was World War II. I don't know exactly what that means, and I don't know what it looks like beyond that. What I do know is a lot of people. So I think the most important word in the CIA is the first one, central. Okay. Right. There were intelligence offices sort of spread around the government and certainly in the military. The centralization under the White House control was really the important thing. And I think, perhaps the US might have learned that a bit from Churchill. But again, I don't know enough about the British system to say for sure. But what I do know is we had two agencies here that basically turned into the CIA. One, a lot of people know, is the OSS. The Office of
Strategic Services, is that right?
Yes, Strategic Services. I couldn't remember the last S there. Those are the spies, right? Those are the people who go into the field.
You see them in the movies all the time, right?
You see it in the movies. The less perhaps glamorous side is my favorite agency name of all time, the Office of Facts and Figures. Which was run by Archibald MacLeish, the Librarian of Congress. And that, I believe, turned into the Directorate of Analysis, right? The sort of bookworms, the desk nerds of the CIA, but still very important. So we had elements in place, and a lot of them were built around, I don't know if it's so much the British model, but around collaboration and cooperation in World War II with the UK. And then, of course, we sort of took off and became its own thing. And thousands of histories told and untold about that. So
I imagine it's so. But I don't remember ever seeing anything about the Office of Facts and Figures in a blockbusting movie. So, but I'm sure there's a movie there to be written. Now that's fascinating, because there are all of these little nuggets that are part of. Again, they're things that we take for granted, but they have histories, and they're very particular. And as your work is rooted in, and as you're showing through your discussion with us today, it has actually shifted the way government works. And so that has shifted over time. And then, as you've summarized very nicely for us in the conversations about, okay, well, where is that balance of power? How much more power should be held in the presidency? Is there enough? Is there too much? What happens with all these agencies? And particularly, I think the point of national security is, as you've told us, it has molded so many things, and it continues to be very important for many reasons. And I'm wondering, I'd love to hear a bit about how you engage with this in working with your students in your teaching, and also as you're doing your teaching and your writing and your research. What's primary for you as one or two objectives that you're really hopeful as a teacher in that classroom, as someone who's writing your scholarship, you're hopeful that you're going to have as an outcome?
Well, I really appreciate this question, because it immediately reminds me of my own dissertation advisor in graduate school, Mark Hansen, who told me that teaching should be, or rather research should be, a model for teaching. Right? So we have careers where we have teaching responsibilities and research responsibilities, and we see them as two separate careers too often. And he discouraged that distinction. He said that you want to work as hard as you can, not just to dump information into your students' minds, but show them the process of learning, and then show them how to convert that process of discovery into, you could think of it as the logic of discovery versus a logic of presentation, right? To show them the process of asking a question, formulating an answer, trying to validate that answer, and then turning around and perhaps teaching somebody else to do the same, teaching somebody else what you've learned. And so to me, the most important thing, what ties those two things together is learning, right? This job is the greatest in the world because my job is to learn. It's not necessarily to teach, right? I learn through teaching, right? And that's more apparent to me every time I have a successful class session. And I tell my students, I told my students last week and the week before, I asked them a question, they huddled together as a group to answer, and they presented their answer to the class, and I learned something. And they got to see me learn something in live and in real time. And so that's, and that all goes back to what my advisor told me, is that research really should be that model for teaching, where you're teaching yourself. That's the only difference.
That's a great point to make, Chad, because I remember when I first, after I graduated from a doctoral program and started teaching, or even before I finished a PhD, I was starting to teach as a teaching assistant. And I was just surprised at how much more I was learning as the teacher as I was as a student. And I think part of it is that you have to organize a lot of information. You have to organize it.
Yes.
You can't just read about it and then say, okay, I read that. You have to, because you have to present it, you have to put it together in a way, and there has to be some kind of, not necessarily story or narrative, but some structure where you can give it to students. But I just couldn't believe how much more efficiently I was learning as a teacher as I was the student. So I certainly resonate with that. And then definitely how this fulfills the other scholarship. And as you're doing the course, maybe share with us one or two of the courses that you've been teaching, but also what you find in the classroom introducing students to this material. Do you see significant differences in the way students show up thinking about government or national security, or is there a clear trend in the way that they're thinking? Are they influenced by the 007 genre? or do you find that they're a bit more informed in a precise way?
Well, so a few things. I mean, I'll answer perhaps the last question sort of first. And the program that I teach in primarily, I have the pleasure of teaching an undergraduate class remotely, thanks to the pandemic, I guess, silver linings, right? But mostly we have a graduate program that includes students who are just out of either in master's programs, just out of undergrad, some are just out of master's program doing a PhD. But we also have students who are in the middle of a career in the military, or in the middle of a career in the bureaucracy, which is not a dirty word. I'm good with bureaucrats.
Yes, right, of course. You need bureaucracies because we do need government. Yes.
So I have students who've been teachers, right? Who've been teachers at fairly high levels, right? In professional military education institutions. So the amount of knowledge and experience that they bring, that this group of students brings with them, is tremendous. And so, some of them, and I don't want to. The goal is not to form them into a particular mold, but to convey to them that the most important thing they could find, and sometimes the hardest thing they could find, is a question they don't know the answer to yet, right? And they think they have an answer, but they might be wrong. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit, I think. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that. But for now, I want to just sort of shout out to two classes that SPIA has allowed me to teach. One, and people might laugh at this, it's Intro to Research Methods. It's one of my favorite things to teach. I get to see a huge range of research projects just as they're getting off the ground, just as they're perhaps maybe getting on their feet, right? And that's really exciting to me. And there's no one particular kind of method that we teach in that class, that we learn in that class. We do the whole range and figure out which one's appropriate to the questions that these students want to pursue. So that's one. And the other is a class called Power and Policy in the United States. And we spend a whole semester trying to unpack the definition of the word power as it applies to policymaking in the United States. And it's just a tremendous amount of fun. right? I mean, you get a social scientist at a cocktail party. They have these sort of cocktail party tricks, which they could just take any word and say, what do you mean by that? And just keep doing that forever, basically. And we do that with the word power. And it's really come to convince me that it is the central concept in the study of politics or public administration or political science, whichever cousin we're sort of claiming for ourselves, whatever label we're claiming for ourselves at the moment.
Can I, there's some other things I am really excited to ask you about, but could I just ask one more question about the teaching? Because I'm listening to you talk about the range of students you're teaching undergraduates, you're teaching students who are in graduate programs, and some of them are going into those graduate programs more or less without more or less directly from undergrad or with not a career before they go into that graduate program. And others, you said, have had careers, particularly in government or military service, and now they're in this graduate program. And I'm wondering if you can just say something about how you have seen as someone who's doing this teaching, the importance of education, not only to prepare people for going into the workforce or going to live their lives in society, which I think we're more accustomed to thinking about, but also is something that even after you've begun having a career, that is important for adding value to what people are doing sort of mid-career or shifting careers, which we don't talk about as much in education. Usually we talk about how we're going to prepare students to go out and get a job and live their lives and be fulfilled people. But you're teaching people who've already been having lives and they've already had careers and they're coming back into the university because this is going to help them to do the next thing. So what have you observed to be the significance and dynamic of that?
Well, it's a little hard for me to project beyond the walls of the classroom, right? Especially because of COVID, we haven't had a lot of opportunity to keep up with our alumni. I haven't been at it long enough to see a lot of sort of what the post-treatment effect, right, if you will, of having a PhD or a master's. But I like to think in along these terms. One of the central issues of political science and public administration falls under the mission of bridging the gap, right? They call it bridging the gap, where policymakers and academics don't talk to each other enough. And one of the ways of bridging that gap is to reorient our research towards more policy relevance. And I support that goal. But I also think it's worth giving people in the policymaking world the experience of what it is to be an academic and to do academic work, right? So that when they go back to the Pentagon or when they go back to an NGO or the State Department, it makes them perhaps more likely to reach into the academy, because they could now, they can not just speak the language, because it's not that complicated. People make it complicated sometimes, but it doesn't have to be. But they understand better, I hope, what the process the academic went through to produce that paper or to produce that book, right? So that it brings extra clarity, and so they could find some way, they could better find a way to use it to inform their own work, so that they're not necessarily going back into the State Department and writing research papers all of a sudden. But when they do want to read research papers, they get the process and hopefully get a richer view of the product because of it.
No, I think that's a terrific point to make, bridging those two areas of the practice and the research, and engendering the greater appreciation of each on either side, which I think is incredibly important.
Thank you.
Could you share with us your own story about your training and where you decided to pursue graduate work, for example? What you think significance that held for the scholar that you've become?
Well, I decided to go to graduate school later in life, and It was because I was a resident of New York City on September 11th, 2001. I was working in the tech industry and decided to reorient my career towards understanding more about national security politics because of that. And sort of happened to land at the University of Chicago. The details of how that sort of accidentally came about are not important right now. But I got my degree at the University of Chicago, which more than anything, I think affected my academic outlook because of the culture of workshops that exists there, which is twice a week you could, in the political science department, attend a 2-hour workshop that twice a week, right? In addition to your classes. And these workshops were packed full of students.
For our audience, if you're a graduate school or a PhD program, you don't have classes twice a week. You have a class, you have a seminar once a week.
That's right. And this was just for international relations. If you wanted to study American politics, there was a workshop for that. If you wanted to study political psychology, there was one for that. Political theory, there were hundreds of them scattered across the university. And that's really the culture at University of Chicago and some other places as well. And it showed me that, when a senior scholar would come in and produce and present their work, it was an opportunity to see that the book that you read didn't start off as a book, right? It didn't start off looking pretty. It looked like a mess at one point. And there was an opportunity to see the scholar engage with the problems that the work had when it was just getting off the ground and how they might go about fixing them. How might, the real debate that goes on in the academy over works in progress. And it just made me feel like there's nothing wrong with a work being in progress. That's, in a sense, that's the fun part. And so that's what that culture really, I think, did for me.
No, that's fascinating. Yeah. And I was going to follow up, but I think you've answered it already, of what got you interested in national security. So it was that 9/11 experience. I was in New York in 9/11. I was still in grad school, but and everyone has a 9/11 story.
Yeah. That's mine, right? It changed my life for better or for worse, right?
You're studying what you're studying now. I was finishing grad school in a little temp night job. And I was just about to get off work. I was right behind, just north of MetLife building. And before that, we had been down on 60 Wall at the lower Manhattan, very close to where the Great Towers used to be. But that morning, I was north of the MetLife building. We could see all the smoke going up, and everything that happened after that. But yeah, that was definitely a very monumental event that has continued to have big effects. And I think, what you're pointing to with your own training there, and that culture of the institution at U Chicago, I was saying, usually in grad school, you have whatever you have as a course, it's one time a week. It's typically the way that works. Doing something twice a week and engaging, and being able to engage with, sounds like lots of senior scholars are coming in, and you're getting to understand a range of people, is really important, because it can be intimidating if you feel like a book has to start off as a book. Basically just write it and then it's done. You send it to your publisher. It is a process, and I think that back and forth dialogical aspect is also something that's very rich. So, you've been skillfully scripting for us a number of different, very complex dimensions of this topic, Chad, and I'm wondering if you could share with us one or two ways that you have observed something about the presidency and national security, your area of research, that either has, I won't say stopped scholars, but that has become so difficult to resolve that it's become an area where there is a lot of, it's a quandary. There's not a lot of consensus over it. Or maybe the opposite. Maybe that's something that just really stands out to you, that has been so compelling, the resolution of which has been so compelling, that has actually become a significant point of consensus, where experts in your area have said, no, this is actually pretty easy for most of us to agree about this thing. So does either of those stick out to you when you think about your area of work?
Again, answering the second first, when I encounter somebody who makes a claim that we've reached consensus about something, almost every time I've found myself in great disagreement, not only with the idea that there's consensus, but with the claim itself.
Okay.
Right. So when I hear somebody saying, we all know, we all believe this, usually the only way to say that is by ignoring people that still disagree with you. So it's not the greatest habit that we get into, but I don't think we have reached a lot of consensus on the big questions.
Okay.
Maybe that's the contrarian in me, but maybe not. I think the biggest question right now, the one that's really haunting me, is that the question of sort of trying to integrate normative claims with descriptive claims or predictive claims, which is to say, what should we do versus what do we think is going to happen? And this is apparent in debates about Ukraine, right? So you have moral claims sort of on both sides about about how to handle the question of negotiating an end to the conflict. On the one hand, you have people who strongly believe that Ukraine should not make any concessions. On the other hand, there's claims about the risks that we entail that are entailed in continuing in allowing in the conflict continuing. It's not up to us, to greater regional instability and insecurity. And then trying to sort of back off and say, well, what do we actually think is going to happen? What are the contingency plans? What do we expect history to look like in the future when we look back at this, given the choices that we have to make now? One debate IR scholars have is the debate between the logic of consequences and the logic of appropriateness, right? Where too often, I think we're forced to choose between those two things. And the big question that I think goes unresolved is how to integrate those two questions and not treat them as a dichotomous choice, right? And not to say that they exist on a spectrum. That's too easy to say, right? But rather to say that there's the logic of appropriateness has to pay attention to consequences, and the logic of consequences has to pay attention to propriety. And I don't think we're good at that. As a discipline, we're not good enough at that, and I think the debates over Ukraine have really shown our failure to build an integrative approach using both sides of those questions.
Now that's a great point. We're going to. I just want to say to our audience, you're welcome to place your questions in the entry box as you're joining us on YouTube Live. You can send those questions to us, and we'll be sharing those with Professor Levinson. Before we go to the audience questions, I'm wondering if you can reflect on what you have found for yourself to be one or two of the most important insights that you've come across from your own work since you have been studying these issues over the past several years.
I wish I could. I'm torn between two kinds of answer. One is, the specific empirics of the cases that I've studied, but I think I'd rather answer with a more abstract way, which is that it's okay to be wrong, right? In fact, I think it's necessary to be wrong, so that you sort of can understand where you're located relative to the boundaries of true knowledge, right? If you're never wrong, you're probably not asking tough enough questions or giving risky enough answers, and that risk is where at least some of the reward is, right? And the second then is to say, okay, it's not just okay to be wrong, it's not just necessary to be wrong, but how do you learn from being wrong? And we tend to train our students in deductive reasoning, or to a lesser extent, inductive reasoning. And there's a third that a blind peer review told me I was doing that I had never heard of before, which is abductive reasoning, which is about how to handle surprising evidence, which is not to say evidence that shows that you're wrong or evidence that shows that you're right, but evidence you weren't even expecting to find one way or the other. How do you handle that and work that into your theory? And it's really what took my dissertation and turned it into the book that I'm going to write, where I thought I was going to go in and find proof one way or the other that certain organizations like the United Fruit Company or the Committee on the Present Danger were influential or they weren't influential. And then I was going to line up a bunch of cases and keep score and it would tell me how right or wrong my theory was. And what I found was all these cases had the same people involved in them, right? The same individuals, right? The organization would change their name, but then they'd send a check from one organization to the next. And I had to make sense of that. And it eventually, I hope I was able to. And I built a whole new theory around that kind of thing that I wasn't even expecting to find that species of evidence, not even the evidence itself, right or wrong. So, and this is going to happen to anyone that goes into the archives to do research, which is one of the thrilling things about art. You have no idea what you're going to find. Sometimes you think you found the perfect folder in the finding aid, right? You go there, you fly into town, you get your hotel, you go to the archive, you get the box, you open the folder, and it's empty, right? But your trip is not wasted, right? Because all this other stuff that you didn't even know you were looking for is waiting for you.
Now that's great. That is a huge thrill of doing that archival research, because you're right. It's there. You can have a sense of, in general, what the material might be, but it's not until you get into the material that it's there. And I love your point about that, the epistemology and understanding how to deal with evidence and theory. And I'm assuming this circles back to what you had said earlier about your students who have an opportunity in studying with you to just gain an appreciation for those complex processes of truth and knowledge. Yeah. Well, I think we have a cocktail academic in our viewership, because we have a question that wants you to say, what do you mean by power? It's actually our viewers' question. So you want to entertain that. What do you mean by power? We can
Okay, well, I mean, I have, luckily I have a whole semester around this. So the way I frame the class, the way I structure the class is around a framework that Stephen Lukes has sort of laid down, not on his own, but he formalized it into a system where there are three different dimensions of power. And the first one is the one we're probably most familiar with, which I call coercion, which is through punishment and reward, getting another actor to do what you want them to do that they would not otherwise do. Right? So you can threaten them with punishment or entice them with a promise of rewards, but they're pursuing your interests rather than what their interests might naturally be without your intervention, right? The second phase is of power. The second dimension of power, I think of as procedural power, and that breaks down into who is represented in the decision-making process. So enfranchisement, representation, and what are their options? Right? What are they deciding over? What kind of policy questions are they deciding on? And what's on the menu for the outcomes? Right? And there's a tremendous amount of power in limiting what people's choices are. Right? This is how Mitch McConnell stopped President Obama from appointing a Supreme Court justice in the last year of his term, by not giving the Senate the option, right, to choose whether Merrick Garland would sit on the court. It's because Mitch McConnell has control over the agenda, right, the procedures of the Senate as Senate Majority Leader. And the third phase of power, which is perhaps the hardest, and of course, because it's the hardest, the most interesting, is what I call transformative power, which is not getting somebody to do what they don't want, not limiting the options so that they just choose the lesser of two or three evils, but to actually get them to want what you want them to want, right? To change their values in such a way that they behave the way in a way that's advantageous to you, and so it's that's the framework for understanding power. It's harder. It goes beyond a simple definition, but it's rather a framework for asking and answering questions about politics, about social life, and so yeah. So I'll also say that to me, power is a relational feature, right? People have power over others in certain contexts. I like to tell my students, in a normal day, I'm the teacher, I'm the instructor, I have power over them, but some of them are trained military members of the US military. In other circumstances that I'm glad we don't have to face, they would take over, right? If we were suddenly under siege in our building in the Virginia Tech Research Center, right? So it's context specific, but you can answer, I think, just a tremendous number of questions about politics by looking at power in that three-dimensional approach.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. Very helpful. It is. This is the point you were making earlier. It's a term people use a lot without necessarily bringing specificity to what they mean by it. So I'm impressed you even had an answer to the question. Our viewers out there can appreciate that. So another question. So you were talking earlier about the impact of digital technologies, particularly through social media, and the way that has brought, if not exactly new challenges at a high level, you gave us an example. It's not the first time society has had to deal with propaganda, but certainly if you consider the ease and scale with which almost anyone who has an internet connection and a smartphone can become someone who can be influential in shaping ideas, that it's at least important to appreciate that something has shifted. It's not that nothing is new under the sun, that there are some things different. But can you reflect on how you understand the probable impact of some of these technological issues on the government and the presidency and national security? Do you think that this is going to become more difficult and more complex as we go on, or do you get a sense that the kind of lessons that are being learned and the resiliency in these institutions of government are going to make way for an easier time of dealing with these challenges? We're asking you to predict the future, I know. So
predictions are really hard, especially about the future. I can't remember who first said that, but I'll put it in my own tone.
That's great.
So I think the relationship between government and media has been going in the wrong direction for a while. I think I'm going back to the 40s again. A lot happened at the beginning of the Cold War. It turns out that was really important. There's an act called the Smith-Mundt Act of 1948, created public diplomacy agencies, the U.S. Information Agency, and consolidated other public affairs, public diplomacy capabilities into this one agency. And because they recognized that the American people, they wanted to protect the American people from what we would call propaganda if it were being directed at us, instead of being directed at foreign, we call public diplomacy when we direct it outwards, and that's fair. There was a prohibition against those materials, those work products, ending up in the United States, right? So the radio antennas the radio broadcasts had to be pointed away from the United States. The printed materials, the government could not distribute them in the United States. and the restrictions got a little hard to manage at some points, because what happens when people are foreign service officers or in another country, so on. But around I can't remember exactly when it was, but that prohibition was lifted because the internet made it impossible to enforce, right? So the internet erases most international boundaries when it comes to information transmission. And I think this is moving in the wrong direction because that was before social media, right? So the presumption was, it took institutional power to, even in the internet, to publish material, right? You had to know how to run a website, and for people to actually read your material, your website had to be popular enough, right? Which is not easy to do on a shoestring budget, right? So you had to be connected with legacy institutions in some way for your website to get a lot of traffic. Web 2.0, we call it, is when social media makes it easy for anyone, right, to, YouTube, we're here on YouTube, right? We know some stories about people who became rich and famous on YouTube, and maybe some of them, let's just say one of them has been fined over $1 billion for disinformation, and I don't know exactly what the legal charges were, but so it's so much easier for anyone to participate, and for anyone to sort of hide to obscure who's supporting them and who's backing them on web media. I think it's still important to put some boundaries around what government is legally allowed to do in putting out information that the American public will consume, right? But there doesn't seem to be much in the way at all of constraining what the government can do on social media, right? So we've seen stories of Customs and Border Patrol agents forming private Facebook groups that have been disseminating some what I consider very harmful disinformation about immigrants. The story of the credibility cartel is a lot about covert collaboration between the president and outside groups, right? And it's going to be so much easier to do that if social media is considered a free-for-all as far as government. We talk a lot about the government censoring social media. Nobody, except me, I don't know, is thinking, I haven't seen a lot of people thinking about perhaps censoring the government in social media, because we're actually allowed to censor the government. We've censored the government for most of our history. We still censor the government all the time. Every military appropriations package says you can't spend any money on propaganda for reaching the American people.
Really?
There were people who people who were charged with crimes. They weren't necessarily convicted of crimes in the Iran-Contra affair, because they were spending time working in the State Department, collecting and giving information to organizations outside of the government in violation of the Boland Amendment, which didn't just say the government's not allowed to give money and support to the Contras. It said the government's not allowed to engage in public relations marketing campaigns about that, right? Okay. They're allowed to go on the stump and make candidates still have freedom of speech, but bureaucrats in the State Department were not allowed to use State Department resources to put together public relations packages about aid to the Contras, right? So there's a lot of legal precedent for doing this, and I don't really see this so far as part of the conversation. We might want to tie the hands of government when it comes to using social media, I hate to say it, but against us, right? And sometimes it'll be for us, sometimes it'll be against us, but we shouldn't be a trusting people. We didn't start off as we didn't found James Madison said, right, if men were angels, government wouldn't be necessary, right? We don't have a system that is based on automatically trusting the people we put in power. So why haven't we looked at so anyway, this is my chief concern, is that social media social media it's we haven't figured out the framework for making social media sort of safe for national security and yeah. So,
Which you're going to have to come back for another conversation about that, because
sure.
now you've got my wheels are spinning about this, and I just want to mark for our audience that this is you said this had not been part of the conversation, so it just so everyone knows it started on Vox Humanities Conversations. This is not part of the conversations.
All right. Well, I hope so. I hope so.
Before you heard it first here.
And as you can tell by my just sort of trailing off, I haven't come close to finding an answer for this.
No, but it's a very important topic.
Yeah.
And this has to get, I mean, you just made the case for why it's important for us to figure it out, though, right? It's not just one of those topics where we can just say, oh, well, we don't need to figure it. It's a tough question and no one needs to figure it out. It's a tough question, but we do need to figure it out.
I think so.
Yeah, there are consequences, for all of us. Well, thank you so much for spending time sharing with us, Professor Levinson, your work that you're doing here at Virginia Tech. Really fascinating scholarship on the presidency and national security, with a very vast wealth of knowledge that you've been accumulating. The book that you're doing, The Credibility Cartel, we're going to be looking forward to that, and we'll definitely have to bring you back to pick up on some of these threats, because there's so much to get into that has just lots of importance, lots of implications for our nation and our world that everyone should care about.
Well, thank you, and I'd be glad to come back. I look forward to it.
Excellent. And to our viewers, we want to thank you for watching with us. We want to thank everyone who's part of the crew and the staff for making possible Vox Humanities Conversations. And we're glad that you could join us today. We also have a podcast called Vox Humanities that you can listen to wherever you listen to podcasts. We're there. And we want to invite you to stay tuned and be sure to subscribe to our channel on YouTube for the Virginia Tech Center for Humanities to see this and other content that we've been able to produce with the Athenaeum and Virginia Tech Libraries. Thank you very much for joining us.